Up next, Paul H. Smith presents Religious, Mystical, and Out-of-Body Experiences. How science thinks it has explained them, and why science is wrong.
Hello, everybody. Thank you and welcome back. Paul H. Smith is the longest-serving controlled remote viewing CRV teacher active today, having begun his career as an instructor in 1984. He served for 7 years in the government's Stargate remote viewing program at Fort Meade, Maryland, from September 1983 to August 1990. Starting in 1984, he became one of only 5 Stargate personnel to be personally trained as remote viewers by the legendary founders of remote viewing, Ingo Swann and Dr. Harold E. Putoff at SRI International. Paul was the primary author of the government RV program's CRV training manual and served as theory instructor for new CRV trainee personnel, as well as source recruiting officer, unit security officer, and unit historian. He went on to teach controlled remote viewing to such well-known remote viewing personalities as Lynn Buchanan, Mel Riley, and David Morehouse. Paul is credited with over 1,000 training and operational remote viewing sessions during his time with Stargate, and I am so happy to bring on our next presenter, Paul H. Smith. Hey, Paul, how you doing?
Hey, Miles. It's been a long time since we met in person.
Yes, it has. As we were reminiscing recently, it goes back to either around 1999 or 2000. At the earliest I can remember is the wedding of our good friend our good friend Bob Price at the legendary Green Pastures restaurant in South Austin, here in Austin, Texas. And I'm just so happy to have you here with us today and looking forward to your presentation. Thank you so much for joining us. And Paul, if you don't mind, we want to get you started real quick here. And you got slides, correct?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Okay. Well, if you want to go ahead and get those shared, we can get that started.
Okay. Good. Well, let's see. Select window or screen. Okay. We did this before. Let's see if I can do it again.
Yes.
Okay. Screen 1, I think, is what I want. No. All right. No, all that did was show the screen we were already on.
Right. So you'll want to cancel that and do the one that says either application for PowerPoint. So there should be like 3 tabs at the top.
Yes, you're right. How do I cancel that, or did I already?
You did already. So you just hit share screen again.
What I want to do is hit that again and go up and say
that middle tab.
Select window or screen. Oh, I see. There's a drop down. Oh, but it only gives me StreamYard, Anomaly Archives, screen 1 and screen 2.
So there should be your entire screen, application window, and Chrome tab. And what you want is application window. So when you first click share screen, when you
okay, so we'll click that. Whoops. So I hit not now. Uh-oh. Well, this was so simple before. All right, let me try it again. Share screen. No, your browser's blocked your screen. Click the screen icon in your address bar. Oh, no. There, I see. Okay, connection verified. Blocked temporarily. If I click X, does that unblock it? Yes. Okay, good. So now let's try it again. Share screen. Oh, well, it has a drop-down menu that is exactly... Wait a minute. Here's another error. No. How weird is this? Nothing more embarrassing when the tech doesn't cooperate. And usually it's operator error. So let me describe. At the top it says, will you allow StreamYard to see your screen? And then it says window or screen to share. Then there's a drop-down menu that says select window or screen. I click on that drop-down menu and it gives me StreamYard 1.
Yeah, there shouldn't
StreamYard.
be. I don't think it's usually a drop-down menu. There should be a window that says share your screen, and then there's 3 tabs: your entire screen, application window, or Chrome tab. And you want application window.
Could this be a problem with the fact that I have 2 screens?
If you have another screen and that the PowerPoint, the slides are on that other screen, then yes, you would select that other screen.
So I'll tell you what, let me turn that screen on and move my PowerPoint over. And then maybe that will be the solution to our problem, huh? Okay, so we'll see, won't we? Okay, well, that's not being helpful. You just made it huge. What did you do to my computer here? This is this is an anomaly, isn't it? Let me try this. Nope, that didn't do it. Let me try this. Okay, now I think we may be making progress here. 2 seconds. Okay, so now, all right, so what I've got is you over there instead of my PowerPoint. That's not what I want. Sorry, folks listening in from home. Yes, I am incompetent. It may not have realized that. Oh, geez, it's not doing what I want it to do. Huh. Let's work so slickly on Zoom.
All right. Well, if you want, you can, you could real quickly, you could email that to me and I could try to get it going here and then I can.
But I can't control it from your end, right?
No, but you can tell me next slide. Next slide.
Okay. Let me try. Oh, we did this, right?
We did.
Didn't we do this? This is nuts. Okay, so window or screen. Let me try. I'm going to experiment with something.
Okay.
Nope. Oh, that just gives you this, right? Yes, we don't want that. There you go. Huh?
Well, that if that's your other monitor, then
now maybe I can move it now.
Yeah.
Is that what you think?
I'm thinking maybe.
Let me move it. See what happens.
I think that's working.
But I can't get it to be the right size here. There, it's the right size.
Great.
Okay, so now let me go with F5 should make it a slideshow. Nope, now it's a slideshow on this side. Ha! Can you see my PowerPoint from there?
Yes, we've got it.
As a whole PowerPoint?
It's got the thing on the left showing the others.
That's not right. That's not right. That's not right. Okay, so let me try this. Yet another, and of course I can't see worth beans. Nope, did the same thing again. I know, time is wasting here, isn't it? Okay, so that's smaller. No, that's not what I want. Let me try something else real quick.
Okay.
That didn't do it. All right, let me see if that fixed it. Ah, okay. All right, so now that's the right size. And from beginning, nope, it's still on this screen.
You can still do the slides this way. We've had other presenters do it this way.
Okay, maybe your platform needs some work. Okay, well, we'll see. All right, so people can see this okay. I have no idea what it looks like now.
It'll be the PowerPoint slides and you, and I'll get out of here and
Okay.
I'll minimize or maximize as appropriate for each slide.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So, as you know from my talk title, I'm talking about religious, mystical, and out-of-body experiences. Specifically, okay, of course that didn't work, did it? That didn't work. There. How science thinks it has explained them and why science is wrong. All right, so let's talk about this. So we have science, and in probably the last 5 centuries, there's become a bit of a discussion or a debate or even arguments or whatever between science and religion. And I'm going to delve into this a little bit. One scientist said this. He said, since theologically based explanations for physical phenomena were such a basic impediment to scientific progress for thousands of years, it is not surprising that religion has been almost universally dismissed by the scientific community as being irrational and unscientific. In other words, for a long time, of course, religion resisted science. Religion had all these so-called paranormal or or non-physical explanations for things like disease and catastrophes and all of that. And then as science started to get better, they started coming up with explanations that showed that the religious explanation was just totally wrong and wasn't true at all. And that led to this scientific attitude that no explanation or no claim by religion had any real value or truth to it. And so the conclusion here is that because religion was wrong about where diseases came from, some religions might have thought that it was evil demons that caused people to get sick. Others thought it was God punishing people that caused people to be sick. And then science figured out, oh no, it's not. It's this the idea that we have these pathogens or a lack of some kind of nutrient or whatever that made people sick from a very explainable, very natural kind of cause. Because science had explained all of those kind of things, then any claim religion made was bogus. So when religions continue to claim that you could have these kind of spiritual experience or whatever, then science says, oh, no, that's not true either, because all of this other stuff was false. That must be false as well. And of course, that's a logical fallacy. Just because one thing is wrong doesn't mean another thing is wrong, even from a logical perspective. But that's kind of the attitude that was developed. Now, when I say religion here, I'm not limiting it just to what we think of religion, like Catholicism or Protestantism or Judaism or Islam or even some of the Eastern religions. When I say religion, I'm talking in general terms about all the ways humans have tried to explain these unusual things that have happened to them and the sort of explanatory context that they apply to things like out-of-body experiences, mystical experiences, those kinds of things. Generally speaking, for most people, until really kind of more recently, there's always been a religious context by which people have tried to understand that. And just because science thinks that everything religion, even in this bigger sense, has come to claim has proved to be false, then everything religion says is false. That's not necessarily true. So let's read some more about this. So this leads to the discipline known as neurotheology. This is fairly recent. I'd say in the last maybe 20 to 30 years, it's grown up in the scientific world. And just a brief description of what neurotheology is that, to quote one of the practitioners of it, Andrew Newberg, he says, neurotheology seeks to understand the relationship specifically between the brain and theology, and more broadly between the mind and religion. And I add to that, and other metaphysical, mystical, and apparently paranormal states, because the neurotheologians, if you want to use that term, haven't stopped with just explaining religious phenomena. They also are trying to find the brain relationship between other things like out-of-body experiences, mystical experiences, and those kinds of things. So as a start, scientists, neurotheologians in particular, have discovered that epileptic seizures, stimulation of the brain through strong magnetic fields, psychoactive substances have all been shown to cause mystical or religious states in people. So in other words, people might take some acid and they have these illusions or hallucinations of weird things happening that seem paranormal. And they even envision things there in their surroundings, which of course no one else sees, seem to be a product of their own minds. And so science recognizes that these things can cause these kind of illusions. I mean, oftentimes things like epileptic seizures have been the cause of actually creating religions, where in an epileptic seizure, someone has an hallucination, and this is documented. They have a hallucination, and then they attribute that hallucination for some kind of insight or perception that they have that they capitalize on over time. Okay, so some of these neurotheological studies have shown that during meditation, and of course various kinds of religious worship, for example, Sufism, where people dance and then they have these epiphanies or these mystical kinds of experiences, that during meditation, certain forms of these religious worships, that in fact oops, sorry, left something out, that people have certain brain states. So in fact, they like hook up Buddhist monks to, I don't know, fMRI or PET or EEG, any of these scientific brain imaging things or brain detection things. And when they're in these states, then there are certain parts of the brain that light up, that seem to be active. And so the scientists think, well, okay, that shows that there's some correlation between when people are in a meditative state and the brain behaves in a certain way, or when people are in a certain mystical state and the brain behaves in a certain way. There's been experiments that when they manipulate someone's sensory environment in certain ways, in other words, they isolate someone in a certain sensory way, or their senses in a certain way, or they do certain things to them in a way to limit their sensory experience and channel it, that it causes these dissociative experiences, like they're detached from their physical selves in some way. I'll talk a little bit about this in a moment, some more. Other studies have shown that during meditation, certain forms of religious worship, activity in certain brain areas changes dramatically, particularly in the parietal lobe. So when people have these ecstatic states or whatever, when they're in a religious environment, certain parts of the brain standardly light up, get energized or whatever. That's not an accurate term. That's not what a scientist would say, but energized. That's kind of what's happening, right? So, and those brain features that then become excited in some way, that leads to a sense of being kind of independent of oneself and one's physical location in space and time. So that is similar to the idea of mystical experiences, where you feel like you're one with the world. Scientists have actually been able to generate that by certain manipulations in the brain. So one particular brain center here, the right angular gyrus, if that's stimulated electrically, that can cause the sensation of actually being out of your body. Now, I mentioned earlier that manipulating a person's sensory environment causes something similar. This is actually direct stimulation, also gives the impression of being out of your body in some certain way. So here's the question that all of this stuff raises. Does that mean that all of these apparently metaphysical states, for example, OBEs, mystical religious experiences, and even some kind of paranormal, so-called ESP kind of phenomenon, are they maybe simply the physical result of a brain hiccup? Is it just that the brain does something and makes you think that you are having an out-of-body experience or a mystical experience or whatever? And because they can correlate certain activity in the brain with these kind of experiences, and because they can simulate these kind of experiences by stimulating different parts of the brain, then the conclusion from a scientific perspective is that out-of-body state, yeah, people have an out-of-body experience. Well, the experience isn't really out of body. It just seems that way because a certain part of the brain makes you feel like you're out of body. So, well, this is kind of small print. Let's see if I can even read it. This is another quote from a scientist. If we realize that mystical experiences originate from the same neurological mechanisms that underlie hallucinations from sensorial deprivation and drug-induced visions, I bet dollar to donut that the reality experienced by meditating Buddhists and praying nuns is entirely contained in their minds and is not a glimpse of a higher realm, as tantalizing as that idea might be. Okay, this is a philosopher, Massimo Pigliucci, who is notoriously a physicalist, or if you might say a materialist, and wants to explain all of these things in a way that science can accept as being down to earth right here within our world and not in some paranormal realm. Okay, so he's saying if we can, he's saying is actually the bottom line is, if we can cause these things to happen, if we can see them happening as a result of certain external causes, then that means it's almost certainly there's nothing paranormal about it, even though people have the feeling that there is. All right. Michael Persinger, another neuroscientist, said, religion is a property of the brain, only the brain, and has little to do with what's out there. So in other words, he's saying it's all constrained within our skulls, that there isn't any real there to our mystical, metaphysical experiences. Okay. I call this the argument from neuroscience. Okay. So here's one formulation of it by another philosopher who isn't quite as rigidly physicalist as some of these others. She says, the neurophysiological argument claims that we have good inductive evidence for the view that the mind is fundamentally non-mental. In other words, the mind is really just the brain, that there isn't anything special about it other than our perceptions. So that the mind is fundamentally non-mental, which is not something that dualists can accept. And she tends to reject this as that idea as well. So this is a place to pause and actually talk about what is dualism briefly. So mind-body dualism is kind of the opposite of physicalism or materialism. And this is the idea that the mind and the brain are ontologically different from each other. The brain is physical, the mind is not. Now, ontologically, that's a fancy word meaning in their fundamental nature of reality, that they are seriously different, that the brain is physical, but the mind is not physical. And that's what a dualist would argue. So, another quote, it is widely believed that the physical scientists can, in principle, give a complete explanation for each and every bodily movement. In this regard, we do not differ from motor cars or plants. It is not plausible that in order to explain the behavior of a motor car, we need to go outside the resources of the physical sciences. And the same goes for the growth of plants. I will take it for granted that the same goes for us. This is another philosopher, Frank Jackson, who's famous for being a physicalist. He wants there to be some physical explanation for all of these apparently non-physical things that people have experienced for millennia and continue to experience today. Okay? So here are the elements of the neuroscience argument. The first one is absence of evidence. Now, what do I mean absence of evidence? A neuroscience has never found non-physical causes in the brain. In other words, everything that happens in the brain, they've been able to trace physically through all of the different cause and effects from beginning to end. And so they never found a non-physical cause in the brain. Now, I'm going to put an argument against this right here. So this, of course, is also another logical fallacy. They are looking for evidence in the brain using only physical research, physical implements, physical instruments. So, if there are any non-physical causes in the brain, they're not going to find them with the equipment they have. So you could say this is kind of like you want to measure the difference from New York to Chicago, so you use a thermometer. Well, you're not going to come up with a legitimate answer to your question, how far is it from New York to Chicago, if you're using a thermometer to measure that. And that's the equivalent of what they're doing here when they make this claim that they've never found causes that aren't physical in the brain. The second part of this is that, I'll try and simplify this a little bit, but physiological deficits, in other words, physical problems in the brain and manipulations of the brain cause changes in brain function, which also changes subjective experience. In other words, what people experience. Okay, yeah, that's true. In other words, things like injuries and diseases in the brain, psychoactive drugs and other things, manipulating the sensory environment, as I mentioned before, stimulating the brain, all these kind of things tend to affect how the brain responds and the kind of experiences that a person might have. So an example here of brain injury or disease is one of the big pieces of argument, pieces of evidence they use. So if there's a brain injury of some kind, that affects how a person perceives and how a person behaves. So one just prime example here is a thing called visual agnosia, which is where there's a lesion in certain parts of certain part of the brain that affects you recognizing things. So in other words, a person who has visual agnosia can't recognize even familiar objects. They can see the object, but they don't know what it is. They can't translate between the visual experience and analyze it and understand what the object is that they see. So they're able to describe parts of an object, or maybe able to copy a picture of it, but they have no idea what the object is or how it could be used. And there's one scientific paper that illustrates this. So they presented images to a person who had visual agnosia. And we have here on the right the image that they were shown, and then the sketch that they made, and then their verbal response. So in the upper left here, they were shown this image of a key, and they still said, even after sketching it and describing it, they said, I still don't know what this is. Over here, they had a sort of an idea. This was the image they were shown. This is what they sketched as they were looking at the image. And they say, well, I don't know. It could be a dog or some other animal. They're right about it being some other animal, but they couldn't identify it as a pig. This one, of course, this was the image of the bird. And then they drew this sketch, good representation of what they were looking at. And they said, I don't know, maybe it's a stump on a beach, some kind of piece of wood or something on a beach. This one I found even more amusing. So the image that they were given was this, which we can see as a steam locomotive. And they sketched this, and it looks pretty good. But they said, I don't know, it's a wagon or a car of some kind. The larger vehicle is being pulled by the smaller one. And we look at it and say, what are they talking about? Well, if you look, they've turned the cowcatcher in the front. They believe the cowcatcher in the front is a separate vehicle from the rest of the object, and that it is pulling the bigger one. So you can see what happens sometimes when you have brain imagery, brain injuries and such. It really affects your perceptual mode, or your way of interacting with the world perceptually. Of course, another example, mental illness. I don't know, some of you may be old enough to remember this movie, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. We know, most of us probably know someone who have had some kind of psychological issue where they believe lots of things about the world that just aren't true. Anybody can be associated with them and know that the things they're claiming just aren't true, from someone stealing their meds to a family member is dead when they're really alive, to all kinds of things. And it can even go from there to even things that we might consider paranormal, whatever, that seem to be caused just by some kind of mental illness. And of course, then it's famous, psychoactive substances can affect the way we perceive things. Now, there is a belief, and there is some substantiation to it, that some psychoactive substances seem to stimulate actual paranormal effects. Of course, mainstream science would consider it all hallucination, but the fact is that a lot of it is hallucination and alteration of brain states and such that is just temporary and artificial, caused by psychoactive substances. So that's, part of the argument scientists use to say, see, all of this stuff happens. So therefore, when you say you're having a mystical experience, it's probably just a glitch in your brain. Okay. So we've talked about absence of evidence. We've talked about physiological deficits and manipulations, which cause changes in subjective experience. And of course, neurotheology then starts from there and continues on. And in this perspective, the neurotheological perspective, it's like our brains are computers, and we have doctors tinkering with our brains sometimes. In this case, it's a computer nerd trying to fix this computer. And every once in a while, you get the blue window of death, which says there's something wrong with your brain. And there's something, just like there's something wrong with your computer. And that's all that's going on. You just have these weird kind of things happen, and it's just the brain. All right. So there's another side to this story. So I'm going to give you the counter view. There's this word, transduce, which essentially means to convert from one form to another. as in changing heat energy over to electrical energy, or one kind of energy into some other kind of energy. There's lots of different things that gets transduced. Here's a prime example. So the sonar on a ship, particularly ones that are aimed at anti-submarines. So this is a Navy destroyer with a sonar dome on the bow of the ship. What they do, of course, is the dome, the sonar sends out a sound, a certain particular sound, a ping or whatever, and they listen to see if there's any kind of an echo returning. If they find a submarine, then there is this echo that goes back, and they can pick that up in the sonar dome. Now, that's just the start of this. So what happens, let me stick with that slide. What happens is the ship, there's an electronic signal that is put into this dome, the bottom of the ship, and that is transduced. The electrical signal is changed into a sound wave. And the sound wave goes down, it hits the sub, it bounces back, it comes back up to the dome on the sonar dome on the ship, where it is again transduced back into electrical signal. Then it goes up to the bridge, or the Combat Information Center, and it shows on a screen roughly how far away, how fast, how big the return is that they're getting from the submarine. Okay, so that's an example of transduction. So here's the question. Is the brain an actual kind of transduction mechanism, not a creation mechanism? In other words, the brain isn't intended to create the experiences we have. It's just a way of changing a non-physical signal into an actual perceptual signal that our brains can relay to us, and then we can act on that. Okay, so there's an interesting logical chain we can follow to sort this out. Okay, so the suggestion here is that the brain is actually an interface and is a kind of transducer of a presumably non-physical signal into an actual perception. Okay, so I did not originate this idea. I got it from my mentor Ingo Swann, who, of course, many of you probably know, was the creator of remote viewing. And Ingo didn't originate it. This idea has been around for quite a while, but he kind of brought it into the remote viewing world, which is, of course, my main world. In a way, it started with René Descartes in France, 400 or 500 years ago. He believed that the mind and the brain were two different things. He was, in a way, kind of the original dualist, that the mind was one thing and the brain was something else. And the thing that hooked them together was the pineal gland, which is right in here. And he believed that the pineal gland was, in fact, this interface between the physical brain and the non-physical mind. There's reasons to not believe that anymore. First of all, he thought the pineal gland had to be the right one because everything else in the brain had two halves, or two instances of. So, like, there's two halves, two hemispheres of the brain. Each of the other functional pieces in the brain have two halves to it. Pineal gland doesn't. Well, it turns out it does. He just was not able, with his instruments of the day, to identify that. So, who knows? There doesn't seem to be a way of hooking up the pineal gland to this idea of being a transducer, but who knows? Anyway, there's the argument is that the brain in some way is able to do that. So if you think about this little bit of kind of a thought experiment. So we have this Mars rover on the planet Mars, and let's say that there are actual Martians, and let's say that they don't know about radio waves. They're not technologically advanced, and one of them's out walking across a plain in Mars, and then one of these little guys rolls up to him and scrolls the camera down and looks at him. So when this Martian walks up towards the rover backs up. The Martian backs up, the rover moves forward. The Martian moves to the left, the camera swivels around, and the rover kind of turns to face him. That Martian, if he doesn't understand electromagnetic radiation, receiving and transmitting of radio waves, that kind of thing. His conclusion is going to be that that rover is actually a living thing that has a consciousness on board with it that is an actual, in some way, sentient being. What he doesn't know is that the actual sentience isn't here. It's somewhere else. It's on Earth, of course, in this case. And the people on Earth are the ones who are controlling this thing. Now, I'm obviously leaving out the idea that there's a time lag for radio signals, but we'll just pretend that doesn't exist here for the time being. And so that Martian will have no idea that this isn't an individual entity in its own right, which is kind of how our scientists are looking at the brain. They think, of course, that the brain can't have external inputs that involve anything other than sensory inputs, that the brain can't have external inputs that involve anything that's non-physical. And so when we do things, then they attribute all of that to us being totally self-autonomous individuals, and everything's contained within our skulls in terms of our behavior, our perceptions, our beliefs, and everything else, and our experiences. Okay. So you think of a TV set. Again, if we had our Martian there, he's looking at a TV set. There's pictures on the set. As far as he knows, everything, all of that's inside the TV. He has no idea about broadcast coming in. And then, of course, he sees somebody tinkering with the TV. A repairman comes in. And as different things in the TV are adjusted, you see different parts of the picture changing. You get wavy lines, you get weird diagonal stripes, you get weird distortions, you get et cetera, even just total snow on the TV. Okay. So obviously you won't see this today with flat screens because you can't even get in the back of them. But nonetheless, the TV is a receiver, right? And just like any other information device that humans create, those are all receivers as well. You may have a tablet that you have all your movies in the tablet and you can watch that autonomously, but they got in there somehow. They were received in from some other source. Okay. So tweaking a component in a television affects the image. And by distorting, disrupting, or maybe even keeping the reception from coming in, the broadcast signal from coming in. All right. So if you think about this, mood disorders could be a symptom of that. So, and personality disorders, these kind of things, it's possible that brain glitches cause these things to happen, just like tweaking the inside of the television set causes the picture to get weird, right? Drugs could do the same thing. We obviously do the same thing. So we know that the brain makes the body run. But it could also be a receiver and a transmitter. So these things that scientists are pointing to prove, and scare quotes, to prove that that all of our mystical experiences and ESP experiences and religious experiences and all these kind of things, to prove that those kinds of things are just brain glitches, might be the equivalent of the TV repair guy making some adjustments in the back of the TV and cause what normally would be a clear, understandable picture to get distorted. So here's the other part of this slide. The brain might be a receiver for some aspect of spirit or consciousness. Okay. And that science can't discriminate, right? So in the absence of evidence for this alternative, there wouldn't be any reason to think that mind and subjective religious experience and paranormal experiences and all those kind of things are anything other than the electrochemical functioning of the brain. Okay. If you don't have any evidence for this alternative thing, then science could very well be right, that it's all just a brain hiccup, right? But we do have that kind of evidence. I'm going to hit some of that right now. I hope we're okay on time still. Right. So I'm going to start off with two experimental paradigms. So what I mean by experimental paradigm is a a kind of experiment that provides the evidence that I'm talking about. So there could be others, and I will cite a few of these just briefly. I'm not going to go into them in detail. But the first one is presentiment. And presentiment is an experiment process, experimental paradigm that's been developed actually fairly recently, roughly kind of got started in the early 90s, mid-90s. Dean Radin, who many of you probably are familiar with, was kind of the one that put this experiment type on the map. In presentiment experiment, what you do is you have someone who's hooked up to a computer, and they have there's some kind of monitoring device of their autonomic nervous system. In this case, they have a skin conductance measurement device, which tells whether there's the electrical conductance of their skin changes. And if we're confronted with a scary or disturbing situation, or in contrary, not a scary or disturbing situation, our skin conductance changes. It's a sign of the autonomic nervous system, how it behaves. It's a kind of a side effect of our autonomic nervous system becoming alerted or alarmed, or conversely not being that way. And so what they do in the presentiment experiments is they have a computer that randomly selects images, and they have 2 sets of images in this computer, a few hundred of them. Some of them are nice, peaceful things like babies, or maybe a pleasant scene in the forest, or a tropical island such as this, okay, whatever. And then they have another set of images which are scary or erotic or frightening or unpleasant in some way. So it might be like a spider or whatever, or maybe an autopsy photo, or an image of a really gruesome accident or whatever. And then what they do is they have the person sit at a computer with the skin conductance monitoring device on their fingers. And then the computer randomly picks a picture every, I don't know, let's say 20 seconds, and then randomly selects a picture, waits a few seconds, then posts the picture on the screen. And as they are monitoring, as the scientists are monitoring this, they have discovered that over time, there is a much greater reaction to the negative image than there is to the peaceful images. Now, that in itself isn't unusual. Every time you're shown a disturbing image as opposed to a peaceful one, your autonomic nervous system is going to react. But the interesting thing about this is it reacts before the picture is ever presented. That's why they call it a presentiment effect, in that you have this response when you shouldn't even know what the picture is, because it hasn't been presented yet. And as I recall, the experimental process is set up where the computer hasn't even picked the image until just before it puts it on the screen, which means you're having a reaction to what you're going to see in the future well before the computer itself even knows what it's going to show you. So that shows that we have perception into the future through time. And that is remarkable, because that's something that mainstream science can't accept. It just doesn't fit inside of mainstream science. And yet we have, I think I might have, so this figure is from several years ago. There have been more since. So they've had 26 studies from 7 independent laboratories that have confirmed that this actually happens. Okay. And if there was a meta-analysis in 2012, which combined the results from all of these, it came up with a figure that I don't even know what you call that number. The odds against chance, the odds against chance of this happening by accident are astronomical, literally astronomical. That's in, I think, the trillions, if I'm thinking correctly. So since there are independent studies in independent laboratories, that also argues against there being any kind of fraud involved here. That there might be 1 or 2 that might cheat, but all of them wouldn't have cheated. And so you end up with an effect that is, from a scientific perspective, almost impossible not to be true. Okay. And again, remember what this means. This is happening outside of the environment where the brain itself can produce this through imagination or a brain glitch or anything else. The other one I want to talk about is the one, of course, I'm more familiar with, which is remote viewing, because I've been involved in this for almost 40 years now. So remote viewing. This is how Hal Puthoff, who is one of the developers of remote viewing, starting in 1972, actually, he defines it as direct awareness or experience of distant locations or events in space and time that are brought from ordinary perception by distance, shielding, or time, and generally considered to be secure from such access by any known physical means or by means of logical inference. So this is a long little passage here, but he's trying to explain you do remote viewing, and when you do remote viewing, at least in a scientific setting, there have been great painstaking efforts taken to guarantee that you could not have got the information you got from any ordinary physical process. That this is something that happens essentially by inference outside the physical domain. So remote viewing allows us to perceive things that we have no other access to but the power of our own minds. And the experimental models, which are several for remote viewing, have been designed to make sure that the only way you can get that kind of information is actually through extrasensory perception. Okay, some examples. So let me say RV, remote viewing, is a form of extrasensory perception. It's performed under usually double-blind and secured circumstances, so there's no chance of you getting information from any other source. And it gives you both prima facie and statistical results. Prima facie means results that when you look at that, unless you can find some way that could explain how you got that in some other form, then it has to be true. And of course, we all know statistical results. So here's some, okay. And finally, remote viewing seems to be an ability that almost all people have. They just have to learn how to do it. And, well, one other thing, I forgot how many bullets I had on this slide. We make no metaphysical assumptions as to how it's caused, how remote viewing is caused. Some people want to think it's channeling. Some people want to think that they have some kind of angels or discarnate entities help them. You don't need that for remote viewing. It's actually, the assumption is that we all have this capability built into our consciousness that allows us to actually perform this function. Okay, so here's one of the prima facie results. So this was the result of the remote viewing session, done fully blind. I know that because I'm the one that did this. I had no clue what the target was before I started. And by the time I was done, you can see how close that was. It's very striking. And I even surprised myself in doing this. That's probably one of the best ones I had done up to this point. Is when I was first learning remote viewing in the military remote viewing unit. Okay. Here's another example. These are sketches, of course, that viewers did, and not all of them are artists. But as you can see, they all got the general sense of it. All of them, in fact, all of them called it a waterfall and sketched, did the best they could to describe it, to sketch it as a waterfall. And of course, that was the target. Again, fully blind. Here's another one, really good one. This one, the viewer made an actual model of the target, and that was the target. And you could see it couldn't be much better if the person had actually been looking at it. But again, blind to what the target was, didn't know what it was, went through the process of remote viewing, and ultimately produced a three-dimensional model that is strikingly accurate in terms of what the target actually was. You can even see the water tower here, a big ball on top of a tube, essentially. He's done it here, as he's actually modeled it right here, along with the three cooling towers. This was obviously a nuclear power plant. Here's another one. And I'll hurry up here a little bit. And you can see the target was this stadium. This was another one I did, again, fully blind. I remember when I sketched this, I thought, well, there's squiggly things on this. I'm not sure what this is, but I've got to put these in. And then, excuse me, later I discovered it was the Bird Nest Stadium in Beijing, which I'd actually never seen. I didn't even know that it looked like this because I didn't follow the Olympics at all. And it's got all these little squiggly things, lines all over it. So those are prima facie evidences of remote viewing. And I'll cut through these pretty quick too. These are the statistical results of very very carefully done remote viewing studies. This one particularly is interesting because this was one that a congressional committee mandated. They required that Ed May at the time was the chief scientist for the remote viewing science program. He was mandated by a congressional committee to review all of the remote viewing research done up to 1988 within the government program and evaluate it. And he found over 25,000 remote viewing trials and did the statistics on it. And again, this is a massive result, massive result. And here's another one. Greg Kolodziejczyk is a Canadian who got very interested and involved in this, did an associative remote viewing project, which I won't explain at this point, but he himself personally did almost 6,000 attempts, yielded this quite highly significant statistical result. And because this involved investing, there was money running on it, and he actually netted $147,000 in this project. And when you start making real money with it, you know that there's got to be something to it. All right. And then another ARV had similar success, but on a much smaller scale. All right. So a couple of other paradigms that you can look into that also produced very persuasive results are, for example, direct mental interaction with living systems, DMELS, which is an interesting research project. Associative remote viewing, a couple of those studies I just mentioned involved that. The Gonsfeld experiments, where there's a lot of work done in that with very significant statistical results. There is a ton of evidence, okay? And all of this evidence points to the fact that the mind does seem able to extend beyond the body. The mind does seem able to extend beyond the body, which means the brain may function either may be functioning as a receiver or a transmitter for a non-local signal. A signal, in other words, that doesn't come through the physical world. And it could easily be true that some aspects, at least, of spirituality, of religion, are not, after all, brain hiccups, but they're real things that originate from outside and enter into human physical existence. So neurotheology may think it's come up with a solution, but the question is, have they really? So the argument, you can look at the physicalist argument again. So apparent religious states, they can be duplicated by manipulating the brain or manipulating the sensory environment, okay? There is no evidence of external signals, okay? They can't find any physical external signals that would cause this experience. And so then their conclusion is that religious and other kinds of experiences that fit in with that, mystical, etc., are real, but they're just a function of the brain. There's nothing external that's causing them. Okay, that's their argument. So you can think of it this way: these experiences are nothing more than malfunctions of the central nervous system. Okay, now the dualists, and you remember back to what I said dualism was, the dualists rebut in this way. Just because brain manipulations can cause these apparent duplicates of religious or mystical experience, that's inconclusive. That doesn't prove anything when you get right down to it, because if the transduction model is real, the brain would naturally need to have some mechanisms within it to translate that non-local signal into a form that the brain could use. And of course, what that means is you would naturally be able to get those brain systems to actually mimic the same kind of experience you might have if you were having a direct input from that non-local input, from that external signal. Just like if you get behind TV set and you plug a few things into it, you can fake an image on the screen that isn't coming from the other side of the city via a television transmitter. Okay, so just because the brain does these weird things when you play with it doesn't prove anything about mystical or religious experiences, okay? So if you didn't have evidence of that signal, you wouldn't need to consider this transduction model. You could think the physicalists were right. But we do have evidence for that, okay? And ESP provides that evidence. There are lots of other things that probably are evidence for it, but we have the best evidence for extrasensory perception, best scientifically real evidence. And so that's why I focus on that. All right. So something from John Fowles, one of my favorite novelists. In one of his books, he said, verification, in other words, the confirmation of things, verification is the only scientific criterion of reality. In other words, if you can't verify it, it doesn't exist in science. That does not mean that there may not be realities that are unverifiable. In other words, just because science can't verify it doesn't mean it's not real. And Blaise Pascal, a long ago scientist, I think he was he was around the same time as Descartes was. There are two equally dangerous extremes: to shut reason out and to let nothing else in. Now, this is an important point because I find a lot of people who are interested in the paranormal tend to want to ignore science, tend to want to say, "Oh, that can't be true," or tend to want to not examine things from a rational perspective. And that's as bad a mistake as the scientists who refuse to consider the possibility that there might be more than they can find out with their science. You have to use both to be successful. So that's where I wind this up. Here on the screen are my two books. My most recent is The Essential Guide to Remote Viewing. That is intended to introduce remote viewing to people who may not know a lot about it. And it tries to answer every major question that I've ever gotten in my remote viewing work. But it's also there, if you're into remote viewing or other kinds of ESP, this is to give to your skeptical friends and family members, because I've written in it a way to avoid all the sensationalism, just to get down to the brass tacks about what all this stuff means. All right, good. So that's it, Miles. What happens next?
Well, I click a few buttons and we keep going. Let's see. Folks, if you want to post your questions in the comments, you can do that. I, of course, very much appreciate your presentation, Paul. This is something I've been obviously thinking about for a long time. I think anybody who explores these strange phenomena that are associated with the various words and phrases, psi, ESP, and the paranormal at large, you get thinking about this, and those of us who want to try and find some actual explanations, we try to explore the various mechanisms that could help us understand that. But and this gets into this debate about paranormal explanations that are just replacing one question with another and an undiscovered phenomena. But I think you've made some very good arguments for why we need to keep asking better questions. Science isn't failing so much as the scientists are failing to ask the better questions. At least that's one way I think of this as being. So we've got some folks just thanking you for your work, and of course these are great books and I highly recommend them. Somebody's commenting about it's the same person, just a great new painting. I'm not sure if that's the one behind you or the one that was on your desktop, but yes, I commented earlier when we were talking about one of the paintings that you brought up, and I was like, oh, is that an Ingo? And you're like, well, thank you for thinking so, but you're a painter, so.
Well, I do have to say that it's actually Ingo that inspired me, though. I had been really fascinated by the kind of work he did without ever knowing what it was. I thought it was all surrealism, which, of course, surrealism has this kind of nightmarish edge to it, and I knew that wasn't quite it, and I'd never seen anything else until I saw Ingo's work, and I thought, that's what I've been wanting to do my whole life and didn't know about it, didn't know what it was, right? And so he inspired me to get into doing those. And I still like to do landscape watercolor. I'm trying to get back into that after 40 years, but But I really love this, what he called cosmic art, because it's kind of an inspiring version of surrealism. So
it's good stuff. And one last comment here. So frustrating that any decent RV session would be discarded by scientists.
Hey, Don, hi. It's nice to see you somewhere else besides Facebook. But that's true. And it depends on the scientists, and it depends on your arguments, you know. So we're working. And any new way of looking at the universe notoriously takes a while to get any traction. And that's where we're at right now, is trying to introduce a new way of looking at the universe. And, you know, it's a challenge. So. Yep.
We still have a long way to go, but the journey is very interesting and exciting. So, well, thank you so much, Paul, for your time. And I encourage folks to go to your website, rviewer.com. And, you know, you've written a number of books, the ones you were showing being great examples of that. And look forward to talking to you. And I can't wait to see you in person again.
Let me very quickly say something about my website. So it's a commercial website. I'm trying to let people know about what I offer in my training. But if you click on RV in depth, I've got a bunch of articles on there that don't involve me trying to sell you something. They're just attempts to help you understand more about remote viewing. So particularly if you're new, I think you'll find that very useful. I do have a newsletter called Remote Viewing / Remote Perception News. There's also a blog with that same name, and a Facebook group also, Remote Viewing / Remote Perception. And anybody who's on Facebook is welcome to join that group. So there you go.
All right. Well, thanks again, and I can't wait to see you in person eventually again, and once things get back to normal.
Yeah.
So. All right, folks, stay tuned. We've got more coming up, and look forward to some more presentations. And at some point soon, we'll be swapping out the stream. But before we get to that,